Project communications management. This video clip is not a lecture on how to communicate or even on how to communicate in projects. It's hard to tell people how to communicate. This video clip is more of a pep talk, stressing the importance of communication in project management. My advice to people is observe others. How do effective project managers that you observe, how do they communicate? Model your communication after them and practice. The project manager is the linking pin in the communication activities of a project. We could say it's crucial to the integration role of pulling a project together, particularly in a matrix structure. Communication flow is particularly complex. There's a business communications textbook author, Ray Lesecar, who says that 75 to 90% of a manager's time is spent in formal and informal communication. Professor Henry Mintzberg in business at McGill University, he found in his study of chief executive officers that they spent an average of 78% of their time in oral communications. Well, this was a number of years ago. Maybe more recently, there's maybe more time in electronic communications, a little bit less in direct oral communication, but still, communication is big time in all forms of project management. So this slide is stimulated by several sources, including a recent webinar that I saw with the popular textbook author Harold Kerzner. And it's emphasizing, well, the title of the slide says it, 90% of project management is behavioral skills. Well, of course, it's silly for us to talk about that as a percentage. He means it, or we mean it conceptually, that behavioral skills is a huge part of project management. Actually, the mechanical stuff in project management is important, cost and time and process and so on, but it's fairly easy to learn. The behavioral skills and the communication skills are harder to learn. And of these bubbles that bounced into the screen, most of these have to do with communications. Now here's a study result. This is from the Computing Technology Industry Association. We always have to be suspicious about the rigor of the study methodology in these kinds of industry reports. But still, practitioners would agree to a main point that jumps out of us on this graphic, that reasons for project failure, a rather large one, is poor communication. In fact, I would say that even if something else seems like more directly the reason for project failure, like failure to gather requirements, as an example, that really it's communication that underlies that other reason for project failure. So let's plan our communications. Just as we're planning our scope and we're developing a scope document, and as we're developing our work breakdown structure, and as we're doing our scheduling, and as we're doing our estimating, and planning how we're going to manage the project, let's include planning of our communication. Who needs what information during the project, and when do they need it? Who's responsible for communicating with a specific stakeholder? Unless we assign somebody to communicate with a particular stakeholder, there may be the danger that we don't communicate, or we communicate poorly with that stakeholder. Of the information that we make available, how are we going to make it available? And who's authorized to access that information? For example, I find often the case that although organizations will be fairly open about project progress and schedule progress, cost reporting is usually much more confidential. Where are we going to store it? Are we going to use SharePoint, for example, or other kinds of web access, and how to retrieve it, make sure people know how to retrieve information or add information. We're going to be choosing our communications technology. We're going to be thinking about, do we have people or customers across time zones, or across languages, or across national or business cultures? These are all very relevant questions, and they're worth much more of a discussion than we're going to have here in this video clip. These will be known as virtual teams, and there is a lot of good stuff on how to deal more effectively in virtual teams. We're going to come up with templates for formal communication. What does a project report look like? Other forms of formal communication. Let's have a template. And planning our communications can also be, how do we escalate issues? If the client has an issue with me, is there a project sponsor in my organization they can escalate that issue to, etc. And as part of escalation of issues, we can have an issues log. This issues and issues logs are also talked about in stakeholder management. And how do we, a glossary of terms could be quite relevant as well. Well, we've got to put it somewhere. Glossary of terms or glossary of acronyms are commonly part of communications plan. And during the execution of a project, let's pay attention to meetings. Why are we meeting? And what rules should we have about meeting management? This is worth a significant discussion as well, is the effectiveness of meetings. People complain they spend enormous amounts of time in ineffective meetings. Well, there are things you can do to control that. Pay a bit of attention to meeting management. Performance reporting is part of communications management. Are you going to have regular performance reports? Are they going to be just written? Are they going to be published on the web? Are there going to be oral presentations? If there are, you're probably going to be presenting current status. You're probably going to be talking about variances, particularly cost and schedule. Variances and trends. Are there some issues that need quick attention right now? Sometimes we report back on our risk register. And I put a big emphasis on how much longer will it take us to complete the project and how much more will it cost us to complete the project. I emphasize those at every reporting status. It's bad news that you're going to be 3 months late and $100,000 over budget, but it's much worse news to announce that at the last minute. It is better news to discover that earlier and communicate it as appropriate. Now, I've listed a number of bullet points here. I want to discourage us, though, from going into too much detail. I remember years ago when the desktop critical path scheduling became very easy for us. And I remember on monthly performance reports printing out fan-fold reams of paper with detailed schedules that nobody ever looked at. No. In that particular case, roll up your schedule report to one sheet of paper, a bar chart that stakeholders can quickly read and see how you're doing against the plan. Part of communications management is also capturing lessons learned. This is a topic that's also talked about in project integration management. How can you capture lessons learned at the end of a project or at the end of a phase of a project so that we and our organization can learn for future projects. Communications management is also informal communication. Schmooze with people, build relationships with stakeholders, which that bullet point could use a lot more discussion than we have time for in this brief video clip. So, as I was saying, it's a pep talk about the importance of communication within project management. Good luck.